Welcome back, everybody. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is, of course, still in the American Revolution, but today in this section, we're going to be looking at the ideological part of this revolution and talking about the coming of, the acceptance of, and eventually the Declaration of Independence and the United States officially becoming its own separate country, separate from Great Britain. Of course, a time that we celebrate every year, every summer with the 4th of July, which we're going to see today how that's not technically the right date. But we're going to look at how this revolution was more than just a war. It's a revolution of ideas as well. And a lot of these ideas that we're going to be discussing, we've been really looking at them for a while. These are ideas that many of these Americans, and we can now start calling them Americans, believed in for a long time. Part of their traditional English culture and English understanding of things, but also we have seen their traditions of self-government in the colonies and the Enlightenment and those sorts of ideas are a part of all of this as well. So remembering where we last left off, April of 1775, Lexington and Concord happened. So the fighting has broken out. Now, Lexington and Concord, as it happens, turns out to be kind of more of a minor scrap in the grand scheme of things. So it's not apparent yet to everyone that a war has begun. There are many that are hoping that it's not going to escalate into a war, that maybe this was an isolated incident and that hopefully things can still be worked out. So if you also recall, if we go back further than that, the First Continental Congress met in response to the coercive or intolerable acts, sent that Declaration of Rights and Grievances, still pursuing the path of reconciliation, and also agreed they would meet a second time in the future, in the next couple of months, in the spring, if the situation had not improved. And obviously, we can see that the situation had not improved. The Declaration of Rights and Grievances has fallen upon deaf ears. The King and Parliament have not acknowledged that in any sort of way. And not only has there not been any attempt at reconciliation from the British side, but now the fighting has broken out. So one of the first things that we're going to see happen next, after the fighting happened at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, is we are going to see the meeting of the Second Continental Congress. So the Second Continental Congress is basically a continuation, or sort of the round two of the First Continental Congress. It's once again a colonial meeting, every colony invited to send delegates, this time again to Philadelphia, to the exact same place, the exact same room, where they had met just a few months earlier in the First Continental Congress, to discuss what is the next move. And obviously there's a lot of things to talk about here because now the fighting has broken out and there's questions about what the next step is. But before we get to anything like that, let's talk about just the significance of the Second Continental Congress in and of itself. This time we have 13 colonies present. All 13 send delegations. All 13 are recognizing this need to work together. Now, they are all over the place as far as what they think that needs to look like and what they think the next step ought to be. But all 13 of them are on board that we have to start working together. And this is the point where they truly do form a central government, because they talked about that, all going back as far as the Albany Plan, uniting under a central government. That idea was first suggested, but at the time was rejected. And they've kind of worked together more ever since then, but they have still not united under a central government. But the Second Continental Congress is when they do that, because the Second Continental Congress is going to be that central government. So this one isn't just a one-time thing. This one isn't just we stay for a week and I'll go home. This is going to be an indefinite group. So the Second Continental Congress is forming that central government. They are uniting under the same government, the Second Continental Congress. They're not declaring independence, okay? So they're not considering themselves their own nation, but they are recognizing that because there is now fighting taking place, some would call it a war, some would hope that it doesn't become one, that they need to start working together. So the Second Continental Congress is going to be that central government, and it will eventually evolve into the first government for the United States. So they are literally between peace and war. They are fighting on the one hand, and the decision kind of is, we have to defend ourselves. We don't want this to escalate into something bigger. We want this to be worked out. So we're still going to pursue reconciliation, but at the same time, we are going to defend ourselves. We're not just going to cower away in defeat. So we are between peace and war. And with one hand, the Second Continental Congress is going to pursue reconciliation, and with the other hand, they will continue to fight in their minds just for defense. This is about fighting for defense. So let's talk about the defense part. So one of the first things that the Continental Congress is going to do do is create an army for that defense. So they are going to create the Continental Army, which will be the colonial army, eventually the first army for the United States. And they're doing this by all the fighting up until now has been done by regular militia, militia from particular towns or colonies. All the fighting at this point, of course, is concentrated specifically in the New England colonies, even more specifically Massachusetts. But what they're doing here is basically combining all those militia together, all those colonial forces, putting them under one banner and putting them under the control of the Second Continental Congress. So that's going to be the Continental Army, and that is the army for the colonies or for the United States, whichever word you prefer, for the duration of the war. They are also going to dispatch someone to lead that army, and that person is going to be George Washington. So they will select General George Washington as the commanding general for that army. And you may recall that Washington does have military experience. He had been a leader of the Virginia militia. He had been involved in the fighting in the French and Indian War. So most certainly his military experience and his abilities do play a big part in him being selected for that role. But another important thing about Washington becoming the leader of this army is the fact that he's a Virginian. Wasn't the only reason, but it probably did play into the Congress's decision to choose Washington, the fact that he is from Virginia. Remember that all of the really radical stuff and really a lot of the activity in the past several years has been pretty much confined to New England. And the fighting is happening in New England. And most of the troops that are making up the Continental Army at this point are New Englanders. And there was a sense among a lot of colonies, particularly Southern colonies, that this was really New England's problem, that they were concerned about it. They sympathized with them, but they saw it as this is your issue, this is your war, it's not our war. And so it is quite likely that by choosing someone like Washington, a Southerner, to lead the army, it was an attempt at unity. It was an attempt at sending the message that this isn't just New England's fight, that this is something that all colonies, middle colonies, southern colonies, that all of us need to be concerned about, need to be participating in, that we all are in this together. So this might have been an attempt at unity and participation, as well as choosing an able commander. And of course, Washington's going to prove himself to be an able commander in many cases, not in all cases, but certainly someone that commanded a certain respect for one reason or another, and will keep that command throughout the entirety of the war. So we'll continue to look at Washington and his activities with the Continental Army, starting with the next major battle of the war, which will be the Battle of Bunker Hill, which occurs right just after the Second Continental Congress meets. So in June of 1775, we see the next big moment in the fighting. So Lexington and Concord happened a couple weeks before. Again, kind of relatively speaking, a minor scrap involving a couple of hundred British soldiers and a couple of hundred colonial militia. This is a much larger and much more organized battle. Bunker Hill, and actually it's quite misnamed. The battle itself actually takes place not on Bunker Hill, but a hill close to it called Breed's Hill. This is right outside of Boston, because at this point, remember, Boston is seen by the British Army and British authorities, and rightfully so, as really being the problem, that Boston was where the rebellion was happening. This was not a rebellion of all the colonies, it is a rebellion of Boston. So the British soldiers are moving to capture Breed's Hill in order to get control over Boston, in order to capture and get Boston subdued. So they are trying to push colonial forces off of that hill so they can take control of it. The thing about the Battle of Bunker Hill is it's kind of a mixed victory. The British do succeed in taking over Breed's Hill or Bunker Hill. They do win the battle. Technically speaking, from a strategic point of view, they do win. They do eventually push the colonists off those hills, and they successfully take those hills. But there's a big but here, big caveat to that. They are successful, but at great, great cost. It costs them significant amounts of soldiers. It costs them significant amounts of ammunition and supplies. They have to march up that hill multiple times. They attempt to do it multiple times and are pushed back by colonial forces. Even though colonial forces are not as well trained as they are, even though there's far fewer of them, they are pushed back multiple times by colonial forces before they eventually take the hill. And the main reason why they're able to is because the colonists eventually start running out of ammunition, and so they have to flee. because they can't shoot anymore. But, it's arguable that had they been able to continue fighting, that the British might not have been successful. It's one of those things where in the end, they did achieve their goal, but it's such a great cost that some people would argue that it was not worth it, that it cost them more to get that than it actually gained them. So it is a strategic victory, but at a great price. From the colonist point of view, it is a major moral victory. So let's talk about the overall significance of the Battle of Bunker Hill. First of all, this is what we would consider the first major battle of the war. Like I've already said, Lexington and Concord was kind of a minor scrap in the grand scheme of things. This is your first large-scale battle. This is the first what we might call a traditional or a textbook style battle, where you have two armies in the field marching towards each other in lines in a very formal way, as opposed to militia running around here or there, a couple shots get fired and everybody scatters sort of a thing, which a lot of fighting in the Revolution is going to be like that. But this was a much bigger engagement. This was a much more formal engagement in which the British, in which their military skill should have benefited them. And it turned out it really didn't all that much. So this turns out to be a big moral victory for the colonists. And it's considered more of a victory than a loss. We typically, if you had to just put a win or loss situation or an answer to this battle, most Americans would say that, we won the Battle of Bunker Hill, because in many ways we did, or the colonists did, because they didn't take the hill, but they successfully repelled multiple waves of British attacks, despite the fact that they were outnumbered, despite the fact that the British were better shots than them, had better everything than them, that they were well-trained soldiers. And this gave them a big morale boost. It lifts their spirits. It lifts their confidence. And that is something that's really, really important, because there's so many people in the colonies at this point that see fighting the British as a bad idea, not necessarily because they don't think that it's warranted, but they feel like there's absolutely no way we can win. It would be a slaughter, that would be just suicide to try to fight, British forces. But the Battle of Bunker Hill kind of proved to a lot of people that maybe it was possible, that maybe they could stand up to the British, that maybe with their superior spirits, maybe with the fact that they were fighting on their own land, all these kind of things, that maybe they could be successful against a British army that was better than they were technically. So this is a big moral victory for that reason. Now, at the same time that they are pursuing fighting, on one hand, for defense at this time, they are also pursuing reconciliation still. Recall that reconciliation means they're trying to make nice with the British government. They're trying to patch up this relationship. And so one of the things that the Second Continental Congress is going to do in the summer of 1775 in order to pursue that is write and send to the English government, to the king, the olive branch petition. And some of you may know that the olive branch just traditionally represents peace. So this is an offer of peace, and it is another attempt, similar to previous ones, to say, hey, we are loyal British subjects. We love the king. We love being a part of this empire, but we got some issues that we want to work out. So it's not cowering. It's not saying we're so sorry and we'll never do it again. It is once again standing up for and reiterating the fact that the colonists felt that the way they were being treated was wrong and illegal and unfair, and they want their rights to be respected, and they want their self-government and all those kinds of things, but also reiterating over and over again that they were loyal British subjects that didn't want to fight and weren't trying to rebel and weren't trying to show disrespect to the king. However, just like every other petition similar to this, it is going to be ignored. The British government, the king, is not going to make any kind of reciprocation of that. In fact, the British government's next move is actually that the king declares the colonies in rebellion. So instead of taking up the colonists' offer for peace or negotiating or anything like that, he instead declares the colonies in rebellion. Not just New England, not just Massachusetts, but all of the colonies in rebellion. Basically just saying the colonies are rising up in rebellion against me. Now, that is really important. It's not just going to sting to the colonies for him to say you're in rebellion. That is the equivalent of declaring war. That is as close as the king can get, as close as the British government can get to declaring war. Since these are their colonies, they cannot literally declare war on them. That would be like declaring war on yourself, which would be against the rules. But by declaring them in rebellion, that is basically saying, no more Mr. Nice Guy. The gloves are off, and I'm coming for you. And I'm not just coming for New England, and I'm not just coming for the people that have been causing all the trouble. I'm not just after Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty anymore. It's all of you. You're all a part of that now. So this is a signal to the colonies, or should be a signal to the colonies, that Britain is about to step up their game, and we're about to see their military strategy change. In these days, that change takes a couple of months to get happening, sometimes as much as a year. But so far, these attempts at peace and reconciliation have not been effective. And in fact, we now have the signal that Britain intends to escalate things. Still, even with that, even with the outbreak of the fighting, even with the king declaring them in rebellion, even with the failure of the Olive Branch petition and the Declaration of Rights and Grievances and every other thing before it, still at this point, most colonists, the vast majority of the colonial population, would not have supported independence and still supports reconciliation as the best option. The thing that's going to really change that's going to change people's minds about that, is not a particular battle. It's not the king declaring them in rebellion. It is a pamphlet, a little pamphlet by Thomas Paine, who was a colonist that came, an Englishman who came to the colonies and thereby becoming a colonist, not too long before this, really only about a year or so before he publishes this pamphlet called Common Sense. And a pamphlet was like a little booklet. And in Common Sense, he publishes this early 1776. Thomas Paine just lays out this really strong and rather convincing argument for independence and claims that independence is just the best option. He says that reconciliation is no longer possible, that we are past the point of reconciliation. He's saying that maybe there was a time that this could have been fixed, but this relationship is just irreconcilable. Too much has happened. And he's not just saying because there's been so much bad blood. He just goes through and points out, we are just different creatures. We have just grown apart. We are a different breed of people here. The kind of government that Britain has, monarchy, is just completely, contrast with what we believe in here. It just does not suit us the way that it suits people in Europe, that we're just different, and it can't be reconciled for that reason. And we shouldn't want it to be reconciled. He argues that any kind of protection that Britain ever gave the colonies was really for themselves, that they've always only been self-interested, that they don't truly care about the colonies, that the way they have behaved has been shameful. But again, just says that what we should have here is representative government that reflects our values and beliefs, and monarchy just does not jive with that. So it's just time to part ways. It's one of those things where we had a good run. It's like a nice breakup letter. It's kind of like saying that we had great times and there were great memories and you'll always be special, but it just isn't working out for us anymore. And he rails against the king here. That's one of the things that's a bit different about Common Sense than all these other things. This is written more to the people. It is written more to the colonists. It is written in a style that is more readable, that's more understandable for colonists who were not doctors, who were not lawyers, who were not politicians. It's less philosophical, it is less legalistic, it is more emotional, and something that regular people could read and understand and be inspired by. It is also more directed at the king. Everything that the colonists have done up until now, all the stuff that they've written, has really been more directed at Parliament, and their beef up until now has really been with Parliament. And Thomas Paine calls out the king, and not only is he calling out the whole institution of monarchy, but he's also calling out this king and says this is a bad king. He calls him a tyrant. That was a rather inflammatory word to use, quite dangerous, to say that he was a tyrant, that not only is monarchy bad, but even if you're going to have monarchy, this is a bad example of it, that he was acting like a tyrant and abusing his power. So Common Sense, more than anything else, changes public opinion, and changes public opinion in favor of independence. And so by the time we move into the spring and the summer of 1776, more and more people would support Congress's pursuing independence instead of reconciliation. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So by the spring and summer of 1776, not only have things not been worked out and the war seems to be escalating, but people are now more supportive of independence and seeing that as the only and the best option. So the Second Continental Congress is going to start taking steps toward that about summer of 1776. And that first step is going to be taken by Richard Henry Lee, who is a delegate from Virginia. Richard Henry Lee is the delegate that proposes the idea of independence to the Second Continental Congress. He brings that first resolution to the Second Continental Congress to say, that we need to dissolve our relationship with Great Britain and become free and independent states. They vote, or they debate on that for about a month before finally voting on it on actually July 2nd of 1776. We of course celebrate July 4th as the Independence Day every summer with our fireworks and everything. But if you want to get really technical with it and really accurate with it, independence was actually declared 2 days before that on July 2nd. July 4th is the day that the Declaration was approved. And interestingly, there were some of the founding fathers, including people like John Adams, who always felt that it should have been July 2nd, should have been the holiday. So your next 4th of July picnic, you can annoy everybody by telling them it really ought to be July 2nd. But anyway, the Declaration. So Congress's just simple adoption of the resolution is what makes technically the United States independent. But in true Enlightenment fashion, wanting to express themselves, wanting to make it public, wanting to make it clear, not just to now we can call them Americans, not just to Americans, but not just to Britain, but to the rest of the world, to say, here's what we're doing and here's why we are doing it. Of course, the Congress decides to write a Declaration of Independence to lay out all of those ideas and make it official. And there was a whole committee of individuals that worked on this declaration. Thomas Jefferson, of course, is the main author of the Declaration of Independence. And we know that he is a student of a lot of Enlightenment philosophers, and we're going to see a lot of those in the Declaration of Independence. So we can break down the Declaration of Independence into a couple of important parts. The first part is the preamble. And in preamble, I'm sure you've heard of before. The Constitution, for example, has a preamble. That's the We the People one. The preamble is just an introduction. So lots of documents have an introduction or a preamble. But this is the part that's probably the most familiar. The preamble is where Jefferson, sort of lays out the overall plan. And this is where he quotes multiple Enlightenment philosophers. This is where he talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is where he uses social contract theory to basically say, the time has come for us to separate from Britain, and this is not some kind of a frivolous rebellion. We're not just a bunch of wild criminals that are just trying to cause trouble, and it's not because we don't submit to authority. Britain has broken the social contract, and so we are completely justified in revolting against that government and creating a new one that we think is going to be better suited to meet our needs. So all of those things happen in that preamble. The majority of the document is the list of grievances. Grievance means like issues, as we might say, problems, gripes. So the list of grievances is where Jefferson goes through and catalogs all these different things that the British government has done, all of these instances of violations of rights. So and they all are started with the same words. He has done this, he has done that. So once again, Jefferson is also directing this at the king rather than Parliament, although he does mention Parliament a few times. But he says things like he has taxes without our consent, he has disbanded our legislatures, he has taken away our rights to a trial by jury, so forth and so on, listing all of these different things as reasons as to why this is justified. And in the end, says, therefore, we are no longer colonies of Britain. We assert that we are no longer part of the British Empire. We declare ourselves our own independent and free nation. We, renounce any allegiance we once had to the British crown, and we are our own country. So with that, we, of course, consider these former colonies now an official country, the United States of America. Now, as we're going to see, declaring independence and then winning it are two different things. So we, of course, would consider, and the colonists, of course, would consider that the beginning of a new nation. And now, of course, they've got to fight to secure that independence and to have that recognized by the British government. So before we get into a lot of that fighting, which we'll be looking at in the third and fourth sections, let's take just a moment to talk about the fact that this was not an easy decision for all colonists to make here about who to support. And there were plenty of colonists that felt that that maybe the British were right all along, or at least just did not think that independence was the answer. We oftentimes forget that the American Revolution is a civil war too. It is a civil war in every sense of the word, because it is a war amongst, in the British Empire, as a part of the British Empire is breaking away. And that is asking people to choose sides. That is asking families to fight against each other sometimes. And there are instances in which that absolutely happened. Ben Franklin, for example, His son was a royal governor. They were fighting amongst themselves over those things. So there are two sides that emerge within the colonies. Not all colonists, or Americans, we should say, supported the idea of independence. So let's look at those two sides and talk about those different groups. Within the colonies, you do have a significant group, more than we sometimes may realize, of what we call loyalists. And another name for the loyalists are the Tories, and I'll explain why it's called that in just a moment. The loyalists are those who are loyal to Britain, who want to remain loyal to the British government or loyal to the king. These are people that are just more pro-crown, pro-monarchy. They're more conservative. They may feel like, and this could happen for a number of reasons. They could just feel like the colonists are flat out wrong, that Britain has authority over us and it is wrong for us to think that they don't. They may just disagree with some of those general policies. They may feel that, hey, all that's fine, but there's no way we'll survive on our own, that independence is silly, or that we'll never be able to fight the British authorities. For whatever reason, there are a number of people that do identify as loyalists. And this could be quite a lot. You could be talking of about 500,000 colonists here, maybe about 20% of them that would identify as loyalists. There are certainly fewer in the New England colonies. There are still some, but there would be less of them in the New England colonies for reasons I think you can probably figure out. And the more south you go, the more loyalists you're going to have. So loyalists tend to be more concentrated in the South and along the Western frontier. Those are where they're going to be more numerous. And this is very much generalizing, but just a few things that tend to be common amongst loyalists. They tend to be more wealthy. They tend to be more upper class. They tend to have larger land holdings, larger amounts of wealth. That's not true of all of them, and there's certainly lots of wealthy people that don't identify as loyalists. But that also kind of helps explain why some of them might have been loyalists, because they were wealthy and they had a significant amount of property. They may have felt that that was better protected under the British Empire, that was going to be safer under a long established government like the Crown. And these are also, because they are wealthy or more upper class people, some of this real egalitarian power to the people, power to everybody kind of rhetoric of the Revolution might not have set well with them. They might have seen that as a little bit too far and might have been nervous about some of that kind of stuff. And throughout the war, many of these loyalists will fight on the side of Britain. There are portions of the war where most of the fighting on the British side is actually being done by loyalist colonists. They might serve as spies, they might provide information, and they deal with a lot of hardships. They are going to be harassed. Their property is going to be confiscated. There is violence against them. There are even some who are going to be executed throughout the war. And then many of them will have even more difficult decisions to make when the war is over. The other side of this are the people we call patriots or Whigs. And these are the folks, of course, that were fighting on the American side, that were in favor of independence. And just pretty much the opposite of loyalists. You'd have more of them in the New England colonies. They tend to come from a variety of backgrounds. But you can look at the loyalists to kind of see the other side of that. The reason they often are referred to as Tories or Whigs, those are the names of political parties in England. The Whigs were a more pro-Enlightenment thinking, pro-representative government, those kind of ideas that the Enlightenment pushed about natural rights and all that kind of stuff were more accepted by the Whig Party, that was seen as the more progressive, anti-monarchy kind of way, whereas the Tories were a more traditional, conservative, pro, Crown sort of political party. So loyalists were more likely to identify with the Tory party, and patriots were more likely to identify with the Whig party. So what we'll be looking at next are some of those major battles and campaigns, because like I said, declaring independence and then winning it are two very different things. And ironically, at the time when the colonies were declaring independence, the war was not going so well for them. In fact, it was going horribly, making some people question whether or not it was a good idea to declare independence not too long after it was actually declared. So that is what we will be looking at next time, and we will see you then.